Thank you for coming to the Three Orcs channel. This is David, and today we're going to talk about role-playing in D&D. This will be a guide on how to get the most out of role-playing for the Dungeon Master and the players playing the game. There's a picture of one of my groups there. I guess they got a little bit too involved into their characters. Up on the right-hand side is a list of things that can directly affect any encounter, whether it's role-playing or combat. When it comes to different styles of D&D, some of these things are more important than others. In newer editions of D&D, a lot of the actions are determined by just the roll of a die, where in old style D&D, how you engage with the scene or the encounter determines the outcome. And it's less codified. There's no exact rules for any specific situation or action that the player tries to perform. Now, I've been playing D&D for over 40 years, ever since grade school. And back in the day when we used to get together as kids, during lunch hour and after school, we would end up at somebody's house. We would roll up a character, really didn't know what we were doing, and a dungeon master would use his imagination just to create a dungeon for us to go through, to explore. What made us excited back then was that every room was unique and different, every encounter, every monster, every trap. And so the whole thing was about survival and exploration. And that was the style of D&D back then. And that's when the BX box set came out. And at the same time, AD&D was released in 78, 79. And at the time, we thought we wanted more rules so we can do more things. But we had a lot of fun with the idea of going through these strange dungeons, much like the B1 module, The Search of the Unknown. And I admit that is that style of D&D. And that was quite popular back then, especially in the convention circuit. They're running these adventures at the convention like Gen Con. They were more like a tournament-style dungeon where the players would use their skill to see if they can resolve or overcome these encounters, to think outside the box to see if they can go far and win the tournament. And then, of course, TSR turned around and published these tournaments as modules. And in the late 80s, I worked with TSR on the West Coast to promote conventions and run tournaments and give away prizes that were signed by the artist. And often they would want us to review and send in our reports to TSR to see if we know what we thought of it. And that was a lot of fun for several years. But at that time, that's when Dragonlance was coming out, and they were changing the way the game was run, where it's becoming more story-based versus just exploration and survival. At the same time, they came out with these skills. And in second edition, as a start, it was introduced in the Dragon magazines, and then they added it to this second edition, which I believe was pretty much against what Gygax wanted, but he was no longer involved. So they added skills to the game. And I understand why they did that, because a lot of players that were not experienced or were never shown how to play D&D, they needed some hint of what they could do, because often they'll sit there and wouldn't know how to handle a situation or what to do about something, and they would look at their character sheet and just couldn't think of anything. And so if you put down skills on their character sheet of, like, they can ride a horse, or they can build a fire, or tie a knot, that gives a new player that doesn't have a lot of experience playing the game some ideas of what things he could do. Unfortunately, it had a side effect where it caused the player to look at this list of skills that he did have, and then if he couldn't find a match for the situation that he was in, that he would not be able to figure out what to do next. He would look at his character sheet and look up in confusion and say, I don't know what to do. There's nothing I can do. Sorry. Can somebody else do something? And unfortunately, that's where the game went. From there on, it got worse and worse. The game became more codified. I'm not making this video to compare or judge of which game system is better. I'm just giving a little bit of history of what was going on and why. And I completely understand why they did that. And, of course, in third edition, they took it even farther, where they codified all the rules and turned the Dungeon Master into more of a referee. And they codified almost every skill and feats in the game for the players and gave all the rules to the players. The Dungeon Master just had to run the game. Then, of course, you had more worlds added with these modules that would add more story to the adventure. And then that would lead to that kind of gameplay. So there's a lot of things going on at the time. And I understand there's a lot of players that like that. They love min-maxing and figuring out how powerful they can get their character to be by a certain level, and then run that build throughout their campaign to see how far they can go and how well they can do. I know there's a lot of people, the way they think, they love that stuff. And I think a lot of those kind of players went more of the route of Pathfinder, and that's the kind of game that is. And then the other half that liked more the role-playing aspect either stayed back at the older editions, and then when 5th edition came out, they tried to bring some of that crowd back. But more along the lines, what happened was it brought a lot of new players into the game, which is a good thing. So, about the idea here of how to role-play better. It doesn't really matter what system you're playing, but I think you'll use this advice much better with the older editions of D&D, where you're not limited by the rules. You're not limited to an illusion of choice. An illusion of choice, as I've other videos I've made before that talked about that subject, is the idea that they give you these skills and these feats and break them up on these different levels. They make you think and feel that you have a choice of building a character to be something. Just to remind you about old D&D, that it was about the player of how good his skill is in playing the game, versus in the newer editions, it's how good the character build is, the character sheet, how powerful he is on that sheet, what skills and what feats they have. And of course, you have to think that back then also, what made a character more powerful, besides going up levels, was the magic items they got. And I remember back in the day that your list of magic items that you had a great deal to do with how powerful your character would get, and the style and kind of character that you had. Where newer games were more based upon the feats that you chose and the skills that you used, and less reliance on the actual magic items. But that's just different styles of D&D, and that I just want to point that out, that was a thing. But what I'm going to talk about here is how to roleplay best in any system, and how to help you along. Now, a lot of this these ideas I got was from Castles and Crusades, because the way they tackle the skills, because that game system does not have skills, and old school essentials and the BX box sets, they don't have skills either. And so by default, those players play a certain way. They play where they can almost do anything. It's up to the dungeon master to judge and to determine with a ruling of what happens, the reaction to the results of what they try to do. And a lot of times that's based on an attribute roll, but we'll go into that in a second here. So when it comes to role-playing your character, in the way I run this game, and the way by default it's run by the old style, is how you present your character and how you role-play your character will directly affect the results of the game. Whether it's combat or role-playing, a role-playing encounter with like a guard or a merchant. So I say there's 8 things that determine, that cause a direct result of what can happen in any encounter when it comes to either combat or role-playing. What determines how your character behaves in the game and is perceived in the game starts from character creation. And when you start with character creation, you have all these choices. And that's where a lot of this list comes from. This list of things that I put on the list on the top right-hand corner is what will affect and cause direct results in the game. So we have class, which can be like a fighter, thief, wizard, magic user. And a class will determine how things react, or an encounter will react to a character. And their race will also, all these demi-humans and humanoids, and they get different reactions in the world as well. And we'll go over that in a minute. And then, of course, you have your background of when you grew up as an adventurer. Before you became an adventurer, what did your parents do? How were you raised? What skills did you develop before you became an adventurer? I need to know these things. If you know how to swim, build a fire, tie a knot, if you know how to read, if you know how to ride a horse, all those things are very important. The equipment that you carry. When it comes to role-playing, the creative use of equipment can make or break or save your life or save the party in an encounter. So equipment is very important. And we'll go over that too in another list. And of course, 5 is how you present yourself, how others perceive you, the way you act. A lot of these newer game systems have many different classes, like, for example, an Inquisitor or a Brawler or 100 other different named classes that are basically a spin-off of a base class. And how you present yourself can be represented in that way. Just because you're a one class doesn't mean you can act like a particular type of person. And we'll go over that in a second too. And then 6 is how you roleplay your character. Same thing. How you not only how you present yourself, but the things that you say, how you act. It will actually determine the outcome of any encounter. Of course, your attribute scores, how you're perceived, if you're weak, if you're strong, if you're bulky, if you're intelligent, if you're sharp, if you're inquisitive. Those things can actually affect the reaction of other NPCs or monsters. Of course, then there's environmental. Environmental could be lava pools or a rickety bridge, things like that. But we'll go over these in specifics here on my next screen. Okay, so the first on the list is class. And I'm going to go ahead and use fighter because I think it's pretty straightforward, a good example to use what we're talking about here. So one of the reasons I want to pick this out is because most newer players, or most people in general from the beginning of time, they always thought fighters were boring, that all fighters are the same, and that how can they be exciting at all? And what newer editions of the newer and different RPG systems that are out there, what they do is they'll take that base fighter class and they'll put a spin on it and add a little bit of features here and there, like feats or special abilities, and they'll call it something else. And pretty much when it comes to role playing, you can do the same thing. You don't need an illusion of choice of some class that somebody made up and put a name on it. And of course, before we go further into that, if you want abilities that include some sort of spell casting, that's what dual classing is for. So let's get back to the straight fighter. So the fighter can be perceived in different ways. The way he was raised and how he was trained will directly affect how he's perceived. To help showcase what I'm referring to in this video, let's go ahead and look at the Fellowship of the Lord of the Rings. The picture you see on screen here is of the 1978 movie of all the characters of the Fellowship. As you can see, we have Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Pippin, Merry, and Boromir. Understand that a lot of people refer to some of these characters as different character types in the movie. It's often referred to that Aragorn is a ranger, but for my purposes, how to explain how you can roleplay a character to be anything you want, Aragorn can be just a fighter. He doesn't necessarily have to be a ranger. If he's a fighter, you wouldn't have much of the tracking or hunting proficiencies that a ranger would have, but he could still have knowledge on those skills, just not as well. And what I'm saying is you can roleplay a character much like Aragorn as a fighter. His fighting style, the armor he wears, the weapons he uses, and the way he looks and behaves in the world. And of course, obviously, I don't think anybody would argue that Boromir is a straight-up fighter in both movies. He likes to use a sword, but often he will fight with it two-handed. I believe in one of the movies he has a shield. He's got his war horn, and he wears fairly heavy armor. I think that's a coat of plates I see on the picture there. So you could definitely, and he's also noble, his nobility. He's the son of the king of Gondor. And then, of course, we have Gimli, and I don't think anybody would argue that he's not a straight-up fighter class. He prefers two-handed weapons, a two-handed battle axe, and he also has a hand axe that he can also use for throwing, and he wears fairly heavy plate that I can see in that picture there, and a helm. And this showcases that race has a lot to do with how you roleplay your character too. He behaves a certain way because he's a dwarf, because he's a fighter that uses two-handed weapons, because he wears heavy armor. If you gave Gimli a different weapon, like a crossbow or maybe two swords where he's dual wielding, his character would change a little bit. People will perceive him a little differently. Role-playing has a lot to do with how the enemy or other players perceive you. And then we have Legolas. Legolas, in a lot of systems, could be a ranger or an archer. In older D&D, he'd be a straight-up fighter. But for my purposes, he can be just a fighter. You can create a character much like Legolas, where he focuses his abilities, his fighting style, on the bow. And he can do all these special tricks with the bow. You can explain all these things and his background, how he grew up, how he was raised, how he was trained, the flavor of fighting style that he likes, the kind of armor he wears, the kind of clothing he wears. He can still be a fighter. Fighters are actually much better fighters than rangers or in any other class, depending on most systems that you play. And they have better chances of hitting. They do more damage. Sometimes they attack more often. A fighter is a much more proficient class when it comes to fighting, so you can make any character a really strong fighter and still give that flavor of a different kind of character. They might not have the specific abilities of some of those other characters, but you can still act like you do or have some knowledge of it. In my games, almost anybody can attempt to track or attempt to pick a pocket or attempt to do whatever, but the odds of them doing it are much less than somebody actually trained for that skill. So as you can see, that's the Fellowship of the Ring there, and I see a whole bunch of fighters with a wizard, and of course we have the hobbits. Let's take a look at them. I have not read the Lord of the Rings game system, role-playing system, in a long time. I played the video game, the MMO, and I know a hobbit or a halfling can be a fighter in almost any system. And I think Pippin and Merry are fighters. And I think that's how they portray them in the Lord of the Rings role-playing game as well. So this also showcases what I'm talking about, how your race, the equipment you have, the armor you're wearing, the weapons you use, the fighting style, how you present yourself, the clothes that you wear, will convey a certain sense of who you are and what kind of person you are. And this can directly affect any encounter. So if you approach a merchant or a guard or a bunch of goblins or some bandits or in any situation, they'll perceive you a certain way depending on all these factors. And a good DM can actually take all that in and respond accordingly. So I think Pippin and Merry here, looking at their picture, I always look this way because that's what I see. They don't have any armor. They got short swords, maybe a dagger. But they're definitely fighters. They're not very good fighters. They're very nimble. They have high dexterity. They can duck and dodge and escape really quick. But they're still what can be considered fighters. Probably low-level fighters. Okay, now we got Now we have the four fighters. We have Legolas, which is a range class type of fighter. We have the dwarf, which is a heavy fighter with two-handed weapons. We have Aragorn, that actually specializes in bow and the longsword. And then we have Boromir, which specializes probably in two-handed weapons and heavy armor. In this older movie, he wasn't wearing any kind of plate or chain. He was wearing more furs and rugged leathers. We perceive him in this movie as a barbarian. But that's how the artist rendered him back in 1978. And that's another look that you can go for when it comes to role-playing a fighter. Just because you look like that doesn't mean you have to be a barbarian. You can still be just a fighter. In fact, a barbarian can just be a fighter class. What you do is you take a fighter class and you put the clothes on him. You put the armor on him. You give him a weapon. You give him strength. You give him constitution. You give him dexterity. All that makeup is how others perceive you. So Boromir there, he could simply just be a fighter, and we all know he's a fighter. But if you look at that picture, he looks like a barbarian. Anybody in your game can look like a barbarian, but still just be a fighter. Or maybe one of the barbarian races happens to be skilled as a fighter, not just a barbarian class. You don't have to limit yourself to what your character is or can be just by the way he looks. A fighter could be raised and trained in a militia, maybe a small town militia or a small town or a large city. And the way he's got his armor that's probably splint, and he's got his standard equipment that a militia guard would have. And that's how he behaves. He's very matter of fact. Maybe the way he acts when it comes to role playing is a little bit more relaxed. And he's well trained in the use of warfare when it comes to equipment that he was assigned. And usually that equipment's pretty basic, like a short sword and a shield, a dagger, maybe a crossbow, things like that. A caravan guard, almost the same thing, but he's more worldly. They travel. So how he looks like the clothing, the leathers he's wearing, the clothes he's wearing, how he, maybe the sun on his face, the hat he wears, the way he behaves, the way he talks to others. Caravan guards have a certain demeanor about them, and often they'll have most likely a light crossbow and a certain kind of weapons to help defend a caravan against raids on the road. And a lot of this will have to do with knowledge that they have. Because if you're a fighter trained in the militia, you have certain skill sets from that background. A caravan guard would have more skill sets based on not only defending, the wagons, but they deal with a lot of merchants and a lot of trade. They get that caravan into town. They have to guard it at the warehouse. They see the pickup of other merchants getting the product and making deals with the other merchants, and sometimes they're kind of involved with that, and so they might have a little bit more skill set in a different way when it comes to maybe commerce. Another kind of fighter, he's a fighter, but maybe he was a fighter trained in a thieves guild. Maybe he wasn't fast enough. His dexterity isn't very high. He's not nimble enough to perform any of the second story actions or the pickpockets that the thieves are up to. Maybe he's a thug, he's really strong, and he's just a natural. He's got a demeanor about him that he's kind of mean, maybe. So they use the Thieves Guild needs arm breakers, kind of like the movie Rocky at the beginning. That was his job. On his daily rounds, he would go threatening people that owed money to the Thieves Guild, and they wouldn't pay up. He would probably punch them in the nose or break their arm. And so a lot of those guys generally could be mean, but in that movie Rocky, he wasn't mean. He was just doing his job, the only way he could make money. But that skill set, he's very familiar with the Thieves Guild and other thieves. He knows how that works. He's got contacts. He speaks it. He doesn't know how to do any of the thieving abilities because he's not a thief. But the way he dresses, the way he looks, he could pass as a thief, but a clumsy one. And he has a lot of knows a lot of knowledge about that entire trade. And he's probably specialized in certain kind of weapons that somebody like that would use. Maybe a sap, or short wicked blades, or maybe a cudgel, or maybe a club. So that's an idea. Another one would be a tavern bouncer, the next on the list. So a tavern bouncer probably grew up in the tavern, maybe. And maybe his father is the tavern keeper, or maybe his mother's one of the wenches or one of the waitresses. And he was big and burly, and that was perfect fit for him to be a tavern bouncer. And his skill set would be based on intimidation, his awareness of a crowd, and maybe his ability to change morale, to intimidate somebody or talk somebody down. And what he wears is probably more lightly armored, but he's mostly probably maybe two-handed weapons or whatever you can think of. But somebody like that flavor of fighter he's still a fighter and he's still skilled, but he just has a flavor about him that his background gave him. Another one would be a towns guard. A towns guard's more like a militia, but the towns guard, maybe he's more officiating, where he makes sure that nobody breaks the law that a character could use in the campaign. And also the way he looks, maybe he's trained in a polearm, and that'd be a good example, or like crossbow. Usually towns guardsmen are wielding halberds or something, but they don't have to. But whatever you can think of, they'll fit your campaign. Another good idea for a fighter would be a gladiator. See, that's a good example of some of the newer systems out there that will take that idea that the fighter was a gladiator, and they'll make a new class up just based on that idea and give them all these special abilities. But in any system, you can roleplay your background as a gladiator, kind of like the movie Conan. Conan was captured as a boy from his village, and then he was trained on that wheel to become strong, and then thrown into the gladiator pit when he was old enough, and he learned how to be a fighter, a gladiator. Gladiators could use a variety of weapons, exotic weapons maybe, kind of like in the movie where they had these weird claw weapons that it's like a glove with all these spikes on it, or two-handed spiked ganvil, or whatever you can think of. And they wear these piecemeal armor that's like maybe a breastplate with all these leather straps and maybe spikes on it. So that would be definitely a different kind of fighter. I don't see gladiators often use missile weapons, but I think one I could picture maybe as me, as a DM thinking about it, is maybe a spear. I think that's a good idea. But that's just me thinking about it out loud. You can do whatever you want, I always think that you should put a lot of thought into what you're going to do with your characters, and I think that was a good idea. Okay, another one on a list. This is just not a comprehensive list. These are just things I just thought of at the top of my head. Another one would be a pirate. So maybe you grew up on a merchant ship. Maybe you're on a major merchant way on a major river, or maybe in the ocean. Maybe you're captured. Your vessel was captured. Your family, your father was killed, and the pirates took you under their wing as a boy, and they brought you up as a fighter, a pirate. And the style of character you are, the way you dress, the kind of weapons you use, and you're still a fighter, but maybe you're using rapiers or sabers or whatever, and you're more light on your feet. And a lot of times the armor you wear affects your speed in a game, depending on what rule set you use. A lot of the games I use does make you move slower when you got the heavier armor. And speaking of weapons here on the left side, these weapons, depending on which you are specialized in and what you use, adds flavor to your character, what kind of person you are, what kind of character you are. I mean, if you love these great swords or these bastard swords, you're a certain kind of fighter. If you like short, wicked blades, two-handed, dual wielding, there you go. You can use a short sword and a dagger. If you love the flails, swinging that ball around, or a mace, the smashing heads in, or a warhammer, these, depending on the kind of weapons you use, determines from others when they look at you and they see you fighting, it determines how they view you, and your role playing of your character reflects that on the weapons you choose. And same thing with armor. If you see somebody, a fighter in action, talking to somebody or fighting in melee, and they're wearing a certain kind of armor, they perceive you differently, as depending how you act, how you role play, and how you fight, the weapons you use, the armor you're wearing. That all has a huge bearance on how others perceive you and how they react. Okay, let's take a look at a different class real quick, just to showcase what I'm talking about here. This is a druid. I got this character from a TV show called Britannia. Fantastic show about the third Roman invasion into Britain. So this character is an outcast druid from his tribe, and he has a prophecy. And I went ahead and I took Photoshop to him for my character in my D&D game, gave him some tattoos. And as you can see, he's constantly putting himself in danger, and he's talking to nature itself, to the primordial elements in my campaign. I actually have him deliver a prophecy from the Temple of Elemental Evil, because he'll sense a disturbance in nature. The arch-druid doesn't believe him. None of the druids believe him. They think he's crazy, so they cast him out, because he's kind of violent, he's bad-tempered, so he rubs people the wrong way. And I have the party encounter him all the time in different villages, arguing with the local druid. It's great when they see him at the village of Hamlet, the T1 module. Okay, so I have a video here of an example of somebody that can play a non-standard druid. What I've been saying so far is everything's dependent upon how you roleplay, the clothes you wear, the weapons you use, the armor you have, your personality, your looks, and it'll convey a certain style of character. You're not just another druid. He's an actual druid of himself. He's almost like a thief, urchin, vagabond on the streets of a big city. He's a beggar. This is different than a second-story thief or a thief that works on a pirate ship. They have different flavors. They have different looks. Maybe they even have different skill sets based on their background. And this particular druid has one, definitely. So go ahead and check out this video here.
Yeah, eat these.
As you can see, that's a druid. The druid is in the forest in Britannia.
Don't mention it.
And he plays a fantastic outcast,
bit I like writing the most,
as they're explaining
is
here.
Divis and Kate. They're at the heart of this thing.
He's a prophet. He's
an
dirty.
expelled druid, and he
He's
is
smelly.
on his own and has been for
He's
a while.
unclean.
Nikolai is playing the most
doesn't care. He has a
outrageous,
bad
crazy
attitude.
character. Very
He's self-important
unseen before. Very
because he's a prophet. He
weird.
thinks he's the
Really
only one that
weird.
can handle the situation. The problem coming to Britannia, he's the only one that
Long time
can.
no see. What are you doing with these assholes?
They're very much
He's
a reluctant
fantastic. I love
parent.
it.
The druid who's got no interest in dealing with a kid, and a kid who doesn't want to be with a stinky druid.
He just basically wants to get rid of her.
Can't have you with me. You slow me down.
You're not mad! You're just a bastard!
He
So
just
he
wants to
doesn't
get
really
rid of her.
care what's going
as
on
he
with
says.
Kate. If she's tired, don't care. Hungry, don't care.
Why did you save me last night?
I didn't save you. They were arrows.
And they're traveling,
They used you as cover.
kind of like D&D,
But at the
traveling
same
across
time,
the countryside.
he does care. Deep down, he's got to somehow.
Yeah,
It turns out
this is a quest,
you're
obviously.
not a pointless,
He's on a quest.
annoying,
He's got a
interfering
prophecy.
little pain in the ass.
Thank you.
How do you like that?
Now he likes her, but he's rude to her. It's great. I love that show. To you. And the next part is race on the list. You know, you have humans, elves, dwarves, half-elves, halflings, gnomes, half-orcs, whatever you have in your campaign. That all directly determines any reaction in any role-playing encounter or combat encounter. If you role-play this, like that dwarf right there, you know, that's a fighter, but he's a dwarven fighter, and so people are going to look at him, perceive him differently. To me, looking at that picture, he's got a lot of weapons. He's got the sword. He's got these hammers. He looks like he can cause a lot of damage. He's pretty scary. And that look in his face, that demeanor that he carries, and that armor he's wearing. It's no matter what fighter you are, all this stuff has effect of how others perceive you. Not just like a merchant or a guard that perceives you when you're trying to talk to them, which will affect the outcome of what you're trying to do, but in combat as well. If you're fighting, I don't know, 20 goblins, and this fighter here and his party in the first melee round slew maybe 5 or 6 of them, and they drop, those goblins are going to think twice. And I think that's going to let me make sure I make a morale check to determine what they're going to do. Maybe they'll hesitate and back off. Maybe they'll surrender. Maybe they'll turn and flee. And how they perceive you has a direct effect on the outcome of any encounter. And this whole list does that. And that's why, as I'm showing you here. Another thing that what race has a direct effect on is these racial hates. I believe like goblins or orcs hate elves and attack them on sight. Goblins hate kobolds hate gnomes. Dwarves naturally hate another race. So that comes to effect too, depending on the monster. Their prejudices against other races. Okay, the next part of the list is background. Now, I talked about this quite a bit already, how your background can influence your character, your role-playing. And as you can see in the picture here, those characters in the photo, to me, they look like they're part of a militia. They look kind of mean, though. But that's kind of flavor there is a little bit of a militia. One of them has a halberd or a polearm. Another one has both of those have a crossbow. I don't know what blades they have. But background has a lot to do with how people perceive you. So I'll give you some examples real quick. A lot of this I got from different game systems like Castles and Crusades. So if you're a knight or nobility, that has a direct bearing on how you act and how people perceive you, how they're going to react to you. It's not necessarily what you said yet, but background does have a lot to do with it. Background also has a lot to do with the way you fight, the way you act, the way people perceive you. So some of these aren't so exciting for a fighter class because, alchemist fighter. So your parents were an alchemist and you were raised that way. You were raised with the skills of an alchemist until one day, for some reason, you got really good as a fighter and you became an adventurer. But this list here is interesting because there's some good choices here, like an armorer. Your dad was an armor smith. That video game Kingdom Come, the invading army came in and slaughtered the whole town and killed the master armor smith, his father, and then he had to run for it. Your father was a bailiff. You were beggars on the street and a thieves guild. blacksmith, clothier, carpenter, fletcher. Your father was the town executioner or an animal trainer. These backgrounds can come out in your character in role-playing terms, the way they act and the way they look even. Maybe their choice of weapons that they like to use, their style of combat. It can be an effect. It can, like the executioner. I'm sure you can use your imagination of what kind of fighter you would be, or influence your type of fighting. Mercenary is another thing I didn't even bring up. Maybe you don't have parents. Maybe a mercenary group took you in and trained you to be a fighter. And so mercenaries have a definite demeanor about them, how they act, and their attitude about the churches, the religions, organized civilization, nobility, how they perceive money, the way they fight, the way they dress, the armor that they wear, the weapons they use. All this can influence that. So let's go to the next on the list here. Equipment has a lot to do with how people perceive you and how you can affect a situation. What if the mounts that you ride? Most people can only afford, adventurers can only afford like a light riding horse. Maybe you have a light war horse. Maybe you have a heavy war horse. Maybe you have barding. Maybe you have a coat of arms on the barding. Expertise gear. Maybe you have like spiked shield, a buckler, spiked armor, a certain kind of special weapon. Maybe you have a whip, a man catcher, something that can disarm somebody. With other classes besides a fighter, but also including fighters, can use this equipment too. A bag of ball bearings, a bag of caltrops. A fighter can definitely use those. He doesn't have to be a rogue to be able to use equipment like that. Maybe a crowbar so you can pry things out, or use as leverage to move a boulder. That gear can come in handy to directly affect the results of any kind of encounter or situation they're in. Special clothing they're wearing. Different kind of fighters can be like an inquisitor. This special clothing could reflect of the kind of person that you are, that you want to portray as being. That could very well directly affect any role-playing encounter. It makes somebody nervous, makes somebody hesitate, make them want to deal with you in a more forthright manner. Maybe you don't want to seem threatening. Maybe you're trying to go under the radar, trying to keep a low head. Maybe you got all these clothings with a heavy cloak and heavy hood, and it hides all your weapons and armor and your face. Maybe you have proud standard on your chest, like you're an inquisitor of some order, a knightly order, or for the church. You don't have to be a paladin or a knight to do that. You can still be just a fighter serving those roles. And I know other systems will actually create new character classes to do that, but you don't need a new character class to roleplay anything you want. All this list of things I'm showing you can let you roleplay with the help of the Dungeon Master being on board to support your character. You can actually portray your character to be anything you want. Special tools, like besides the ability to keep your blade sharp and clean and your armor repaired. And then, of course, we get to the next point on the list, which is how you present oneself. The style of clothing can directly affect the response of any role-playing encounter or even combat. So when you're talking to a guard or a merchant or maybe an innkeeper, the style of clothing that you're wearing portrays you as an official or somebody on an important mission, somebody not to be trifled with. He's going to react a certain way. It's going to influence how he reacts to you. The style of clothing that you choose is you want to keep your head low. You don't want to draw any attention. That could directly affect as well. I have a half-orc in my Greyhawk campaign that wants to keep his head low. He's a great fighter, but when he goes into town with the party, he doesn't want anybody looking at him. So he never smiles. He keeps his hood over his head, and you can barely see his face, and they say his ranger's cloak, and he can usually get away with that, and he never engages in any conversations because he doesn't want to stir up any trouble. You can display honorifics or even heraldry. Maybe you have the sign of your order on your chest, or your cloak, or your shield. Maybe the NPC will recognize that. It'll influence how he talks to you. It's how he responds to you, what you're trying to get accomplished. Or maybe the bad guys, maybe the bandits see that, oh my God, they're here. Everybody run, they found us. And that would influence the morale of the fight. Holy symbols can do the same thing. If they find out that the Order of St. Cuthbert's found them out, Or you're trying to talk to a guard to get into a building, and you have a holy symbol of like the god of Pelor. He's going to react to you quite differently than if you didn't have that. The demeanor that you use, the way you talk, the way you roleplay. Are you grumpy? Are you angry? Are you inquisitive? Are you friendly? Do you smile all the time? That will have a direct effect on how others respond to you in the game. In combat, when you're fighting monsters or NPCs like bandits, your demeanor would also affect that as well. It'll determine whether or not how fast they break their morale, or they'll surrender or run away or fight to the bitter end. If it looks like you're going to slaughter and murder all of them, they're going to have a quite different reaction to you than somebody that's just trying to maybe portray as being, please stop this, we're not going to hurt anybody, just lay your arms down and we'll let you go. That has a direct effect on the outcome of that encounter. Your profession as well. Do you portray yourself as a pirate? Do you portray yourself as a merchant caravan guard? Or maybe a warrior of the kingdom? That can have a direct reaction to the NPC you're dealing with, or maybe the monsters or the bandits. Any equipment that can be seen, like your weapons, your armor, the clothing, how they perceive you in the world is what they see when you walk up to them. How you portray yourself, and all the equipment that you have, like your weapons and your armor and anything else in clothing, will reflect all that. So that's also be taken into consideration. And of course, the next on the list is role playing, which we've pretty much covered. It's how others perceive you. It's the roles that you display. How you're being perceived. You are consciously acting in a certain way for how others perceive you, and that will cause the direct results of that encounter, how they respond to you. Attribute scores, same thing, except they kind of force you to roleplay a certain way if you're trying to roleplay. Like if you have a low constitution, you're going to seem frail. If you have a lot of strength, you're going to seem intimidating and strong. Others are going to react to you differently. If you don't seem inquisitive, if you seem sharp, if you're deemed to be seen observant, or maybe distraught, your stats will directly affect it. That can all directly affect the outcome of the encounter. And then the last is environmental. How you interact with the environment around you. There could be a room full of lava pools. There could be a rickety bridge. The tavern could have all wooden stools and wooden tables that look like they're about to fall apart. Maybe there's a chandelier. The cave is too dark and you don't have any light source and you can't see very well. All that environmental, the creative use of environment around you can directly affect the outcome of that encounter. Okay, so go back to the main list. So we went over each of these 8 things that will affect an outcome of an encounter. You can role play your abilities as a character without a list of skills telling you what you can or can't do. A lot of that has to do with your class, race, and background, the way you were raised. It will explain why you're good at something or not. If you know how to read, if you know how to ride a horse, if you know how to build a fire or tie a knot. But I think what the carry away from this video, which is more important than anything, is for a player to be able to leverage all these things into any encounter to play better with these lists of things they can leverage to interact with any situation, any encounter, to be able to influence the outcome of the event. Role-playing better doesn't have anything to do with talking in funny voices or talking with an accent. It does help. It's fun to do, but it's not really required to be able to play better in the game. If you can interact and be immersive with your character, being mindful of these things, I think it'll help you become a much better player. We all did this mostly in the early days before the rules got codified, with all these things that were telling players what they can or can't do. And I believe that if you just follow these ground rules and role-playing, it's going to help you a lot. And it'll make the game a lot more fun and much more memorable. So if you have any questions or any comments, please list them down below. So if you like what I had to say and like this video, please go to my Patreon, links below, and support me, and that will encourage me to make more videos in the future about subjects like this. I think there's a lot more videos that can be made that other YouTubers do not even touch on, and I've been doing a lot of those lately. I've been trying to focus on that, and I got some pretty good ideas what to do in the future. So thank you so much for watching, and happy gaming.